The winter sky above Alaska in 1943 was a wasteland of gray. Silent, merciless, and infinite. Snow whipped across the tundra like smoke. The cold wasn't just air. It was a force that swallowed steel, cracked engines, and froze men where they stood. It was here, in a place the world had forgotten, that the United States began building something impossible. A runway carved not from dirt or concrete, but from ice. Japanese intelligence officers, reading intercepted reports and coded messages from the Aleutians, laughed when they heard about it. Ice runways? They said it was nonsense, a desperate American bluff. To them, the North was a graveyard of ambitions, a place where even machines froze to death. But the Americans were serious. It began quietly, with a handful of engineers from the Army Air Forces and the U.S. Corps of Engineers landing on a frozen inlet near Fairbanks. Their mission was simple on paper, but absurd in reality. Prove that a bomber as large as the B-29 Superfortress could take off and land on solid ice. To the untrained eye, it looked suicidal. The B-29 was nearly 100 feet long, weighed over 140,000 pounds when loaded, and carried engines so powerful they could melt snow at idle. Landing such a monster on frozen tundra was like trying to park a battleship on glass. But necessity had driven madness before. After the Japanese invasion of the Aleutian Islands, Attu and Kiska, in 1942, Alaska had become a new front in the Pacific War. The U.S. suddenly realized that its northern flank, only a few hundred miles from Japanese-held territory, was both a weakness and an opportunity. If America could turn the Arctic into a runway, it could strike Japan from the top of the world, bypassing the vast Pacific entirely. General Henry Hap Arnold approved the plan under a veil of secrecy. Few knew the full scope. Fewer still believed it could work. The code name was simple: Operation Icefield, a test of engineering, endurance, and imagination, the kind of project that existed on the line between genius and insanity. The first phase began in January 1943, when crews from the 11th Air Force began cutting into a frozen lake near Ladd Field, with saws, bulldozers, and dynamite. The temperature hovered at -40. Engines wouldn't start unless fires were lit beneath them. Coffee froze in cups before it could be drunk. But they persisted. They shaved the surface of the ice until it was mirror smooth, then flooded it in layers, creating a crystalline strip nearly 8,000 feet long and 150 feet wide. Under floodlights, it glittered like a diamond in the dark, a runway that looked like it belonged to another planet. They reinforced it with frozen gravel, trucked in by convoys that risked avalanches and whiteouts. When sunlight returned, they painted black lines along the edges to help pilots find it in the endless snow. The men called it the Glass Highway. Back in Tokyo, the Imperial Navy's Intelligence Division intercepted vague radio chatter about northern experiments, but analysts dismissed it. They believed Alaska was a dead end, a logistical nightmare. In their reports, they called American efforts an extravagant gesture by a wealthy but naive enemy. They had no idea that within 2 years, the sound of 4 Wright Cyclone engines would echo over the Pacific, carried from those very frozen fields. The first tests began with smaller planes, C-47 transports, B-25 Mitchells, and P-38 Lightnings. Each skidded down the ice, wheels squealing, propellers tearing snow into white storms. Each landed harder than expected, sliding hundreds of feet before stopping. But the ice held. Not a crack, not a break. Encouraged, engineers thickened the surface again, layering another foot of frozen water. They had built an airfield that could flex under pressure, that could heal itself with every refreeze. It was an engineering marvel, and a secret weapon. At night, under the aurora's shifting green light, Mechanics huddled inside hangars made of snow and steel drums, their breath rising like steam. They kept engines warm with oil stoves and tarps, rotating propellers by hand to prevent freezing. Every noise echoed across the tundra, the hammering of wrenches, the rumble of generators, the low growl of the wind. In those moments, it felt less like a base and more like a civilization clinging to the edge of the world. Then, in March, came the impossible. A B-29 prototype, one of the first ever built, was flown to Ladd Field under extreme secrecy. Its arrival was so classified that most of the ground crew were told it was a new transport test. As it taxied into position on that frozen runway, the entire project hung in the balance. If the ice cracked, if the engines overpowered the surface, if even one wheel broke through, the entire northern strategy would collapse. Pilots and engineers stood silent, frost clinging to their eyebrows, watching as the engines roared to life. The propellers whipped snow into a blizzard. The ice moaned, but didn't break. Then the brakes released. The B-29 began to roll, slowly at first, then faster. The roar deepened, vibrating through the tundra. Wheels screamed, the wings lifted, and then, impossibly, the giant rose into the gray sky. The men below erupted in cheers, their voices lost in the wind. They had done it. They had built a runway out of ice and sent the world's largest bomber into the clouds. That takeoff was more than a test. It was a message, a silent warning to an enemy that didn't yet know what was coming. Because while Japanese analysts continued to file reports, calling America's Arctic efforts insignificant, the truth was already written in contrails over Alaska. The era of ice had begun, and it would soon burn Japan's cities from above. By the spring of 1944, Operation Icefield was no longer an experiment. It was a network. Dozens of frozen airstrips now stretched across Alaska and the Aleutians, from Ladd Field near Fairbanks to the wind-swept edges of Adak, Shemya, and Amchitka. Each one carved from ice, rebuilt every few weeks as the season shifted, and each one manned by crews who'd learned to fight both weather and physics. The U.S. Army Air Forces called it the Northern Ferry Route. To Japanese intelligence, it was still a rumor. Whispers about ghost bases, where American aircraft appeared and vanished overnight. In Tokyo, analysts scrawled across maps in frustration. The Aleutians were supposed to be a frozen barrier, not a highway. Yet, somehow, America had turned ice into asphalt. In February 1944, reconnaissance aircraft began ferrying over the route in preparation for the arrival of the new B-29 superfortresses. These weren't the same bombers that had lumbered across the skies a year before. These were refined, optimized, and deadly. Their pressurized cabins gleaming, their wings extended, their engines running hotter than anything before. They were designed to fly higher, farther, and faster than any bomber in history. But to use them, the U.S. needed forward bases. Far forward. The Pacific was vast, and the Mariana Islands campaign was still months away. The northern path through Alaska and Siberia offered a shortcut to Japan's industrial heartland, if only they could take off from ice. So, the frozen runways expanded. Engineers laid crushed volcanic ash beneath the ice to improve traction. Special glycol-based mixtures were sprayed on the surface to slow melting. By March, American scientists had effectively invented a new kind of runway, a hybrid of physics and perseverance. Civilians from the Alaska Railroad were recruited to haul tons of equipment into places no road had ever reached. Crews built hangars out of Quonset huts and oil drums, using snow as insulation. Fuel was stored in massive ice caverns, drilled deep into permafrost. It was the strangest airfield system ever conceived, one that grew stronger the colder it became. The first official long-range trial came that April, a B-24. Liberator took off from Ladd Field. touched down at Nome, refueled on ice, and continued across the Bering Strait to the Soviet Union. From there, it turned south, tracing a path that Japanese radar never saw. For the first time in the war, the Arctic had become a stealth corridor. The Soviets called it the Alaska-Siberia Route, or ALSIB, but within the U.S. Army Air Forces, it was simply the Ice Road, and it worked. Between 1943 and 1945, more than 8,000 American aircraft, including fighters, bombers, and transports, would cross that frozen bridge to join the fight from the other side of the world. Japanese intelligence, meanwhile, dismissed the reports. Their northern observation posts at Paramushiro and the Kuril Islands were fog-bound most of the year. Weather planes rarely returned. When they did, they brought back nothing but static blurred photographs of clouds. Tokyo's analysts concluded that the Americans had abandoned Alaska entirely. In their spring 1944 assessment, the Imperial Army's Intelligence Bureau declared, "The Arctic holds no strategic value. America's priorities lie in the Central Pacific." That line, a single sentence, would cost Japan the sky. For the men stationed along the ice-field bases, life was brutal and monotonous. Wind could reach 90 miles per hour. Tents vanished overnight. Engines had to be run every 3 hours just to stay warm. And yet, morale stayed high. Each man understood the stakes. They weren't just guarding snow and silence. They were guarding the only runway on Earth that could reach Japan before the Marianas fell. At night, they huddled inside Quonset huts, listening to the radio crackle with fragments from distant battles. Saipan, Kwajalein, Truk, and they waited for the day when the new bombers would arrive and the white silence of Alaska would erupt into thunder. By midsummer, that day came. The first wave of B-29s from the 20th Air Force landed at Ladd Field under the cover of an Arctic storm. Each bomber's wingtip nearly brushed the snowbanks. The engines bellowed so loud they rattled the frozen hangars like tin drums. To the men watching, it felt like the arrival of a new era. These machines weren't just bombers, they were empires of aluminum and fire. Their arrival transformed Alaska from a forgotten frontier into a launchpad for retribution. The pilots nicknamed them snow fortresses. And they were about to prove that even the coldest runway could burn with vengeance. Japanese intercept operators along the northern coast began to hear new, faint radio chatter in July, coded transmissions, strange call signs, bursts of static that didn't match known bases. They assumed it was weather traffic, until one night, radar stations on the Kurils detected unidentified aircraft approaching from the north. They were too fast to be reconnaissance planes, too high to be patrol bombers. Then they vanished from the screens. The reports were logged, filed, and ignored. A junior intelligence officer in Tokyo scribbled a note in the margin, possibly from Alaska. Unlikely. Ice fields cannot support such aircraft. He underlined it twice. 2 months later, those same aircraft would be seen again. This time, over the northern reaches of Honshu. It began with a hum no one could place, a distant vibration above the clouds, faint but unnatural, the kind that made radar operators glance twice at their instruments. It was August 1944, and Japan's northern skies were supposed to be empty. No one expected American bombers to come from the Arctic. But they did. The first sighting came from fishermen off Hokkaido. They looked up from the decks of their trawlers and saw dark silhouettes moving silently against the dawn. 4-engined giants flying higher than any plane they'd ever seen. The sound was different, too. Deep, rolling, more like a train than an aircraft. By the time Imperial Army observers in Sapporo radioed a warning, the formation had already crossed back into the clouds. The first northern raid had ended before Japan even knew it had begun. Hours later, American engineers at Ladd Field received a coded transmission. Eagle 1 complete. Ice-Runway holds. Cheers echoed through the hangars. The impossible had been done. The B-29 had flown from frozen Alaska, struck the enemy's northern flank, and returned without loss. It wasn't a large raid, just a reconnaissance strike against oil depots and communication towers near Hakodate. But symbolically, it was devastating. It proved that the route worked. The ice could carry the weight of total war. Tokyo dismissed the reports at first. The Army claimed it was propaganda. The Navy insisted the planes had come from the south, perhaps from captured islands or a new carrier. But in the following weeks, the pattern repeated. Late-night air raid alarms in northern Japan, unidentified bombers seen streaking through the clouds, and then the sound, that deep, thunderous vibration from above the storm. Imperial Navy radar stations along the Kurils reported increasing traffic from the northwest. The transmissions were faint, distorted by the aurora, but unmistakable. Something was flying through the polar night. At Ladd Field, the operation was expanding faster than the Arctic could keep up. Snowplows worked around the clock to keep the runways clear. Fuel convoys crossed frozen rivers under armed guard. Every hour, engines were turned by hand to prevent freezing solid. By late 1944, the airfield resembled a city. Miles of flood-lit ice, steel hangars, and endless rows of B-29s. Their wings rimed with frost. The men joked that they were building Detroit on the tundra. But the mood was serious. Every bomber that left those runways carried more than bombs. They carried proof that geography itself could be defeated. American planners knew Japan's northern defenses were weak. The Imperial Navy had spent its resources guarding the Central Pacific, the Philippines, Formosa, and the Marianas. No one had expected an attack from the top of the world. That was exactly why the plan worked. Every mission launched from Alaska tested not only the limits of aircraft, but the limits of human endurance. Temperatures could drop to -50. Pilots flew with oxygen masks frozen to their faces, fingers bleeding from frostbite as they held the yoke. Cabin heaters failed. Oil thickened in the lines. Yet the missions continued. For the Japanese analysts, the northern route remained an unsolved mystery. They intercepted scattered fragments of Allied communication referring to Operation Cold Front and Project Avalanche. But they couldn't trace their origin. No radio triangulation pointed to any island base. To them, the Arctic was still impossible. In November 1944, Imperial Intelligence released a 47-page report on Arctic operations by the enemy. Its conclusion was confident. No bomber of such size can take off from ice. American claims are illusion. 3 months later, Tokyo would burn under the contrails of aircraft that had proved exactly the opposite. For the men at the ice bases, the danger wasn't the enemy. It was the environment itself. Crews called the Aleutian winds the White Demon. Snow squalls could blind pilots seconds before takeoff. Runway lights froze solid in their housings, forcing mechanics to chip them out by hand. Fuel drums exploded from pressure changes, but the worst part was the silence. When the wind stopped, the world felt hollow. Just ice, darkness, and the distant hum of engines idling in the cold. Many wrote letters home, describing it as the loneliest place on Earth. Others said it felt like being stationed on the moon. And yet, from that frozen nowhere, history's most powerful bombers launched their first northern campaign. By the start of 1945, Japan's war planners had one obsession: stopping the B-29s. They had watched with horror as cities like Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe went up in flames from southern raids launched from the Marianas. But the most unnerving reports came not from those fronts. They came from the north. Fishermen near Hokkaido whispered about bombers appearing out of the polar clouds. Radar operators at Paramushiro swore they saw ghost flights on their screens, massive formations that vanished before interceptors could scramble. And yet, reconnaissance flights sent to find these mysterious bases returned empty. The Arctic, they said, was uninhabited. The Americans couldn't possibly be flying from there, but they were. Inside the Imperial Navy's intelligence headquarters in Tokyo, disbelief turned to alarm. A captured American weather balloon had crashed in the Kuril Islands. Inside it were charts, not of the Pacific, but of Alaska's northern coastlines. They showed coded grids labeled Runway Series B-29, 1944. General Toyota, the Navy's chief of staff, held the paper up during a meeting and asked, "Are we to believe they build airfields on ice?" No one answered. Even Japan's own engineers couldn't conceive of such a thing. While the Imperial Navy tried to locate the phantom bases, the Americans expanded them. At Amchitka and Shemya, the U.S. Air Force constructed heated hangars with geothermal vents buried beneath the runways. Pipes pumped warm brine from underground springs, keeping the ice pliable and stable. Fuel tanks were sunk directly into permafrost, where temperatures remained constant year-round. It was engineering alchemy, half science, half improvisation. Each base became a self-sustaining organism. Power stations, weather towers, radar domes, barracks dug into snow, and miles of flood-lit runway shimmering beneath the aurora. The Japanese saw none of it. Fog, distance, and secrecy were better than camouflage. When the first reconnaissance Zeros flew toward the Aleutians in February 1945, they found only endless white. Their instruments iced over. Engines coughed and died. Most never returned. The few pilots who did reported no significant American presence. In truth, they had flown right past it. The bases were so remote, so perfectly blended with the landscape, that they looked like frozen lakes from above. Even U.S. pilots had trouble finding them without radio beacons. It was, as one engineer said, the perfect secret, hiding not in shadows, but in glare. In March, American operations intensified. B-29s began long-range testing runs to simulate strikes on Japan's northern ports. Each mission was a logistical nightmare. Pilots flew 9-hour legs through blizzards, guided by celestial navigation and luck. Fuel froze in lines, hydraulics stiffened, and frost built up on propellers until it looked like armor plating. Yet they kept flying. Every successful takeoff from the ice meant the Pacific was shrinking. What once required an island invasion now required only cold and courage. Tokyo's scientists tried to replicate the concept. In late spring 1945, a test was conducted on Lake Biwa, a small-scale ice runway for reconnaissance aircraft. It failed catastrophically. The surface cracked under its own weight, sending a Ki-46 Dyna reconnaissance plane sinking nose first into the lake. The attempt was classified and never repeated. Meanwhile, U.S. forces were perfecting their own methods, learning how to strengthen ice using layered freezing and controlled flooding. They had developed a formula of water, sawdust, and air bubbles that created a material tougher than concrete. It was called pykrete, and the tests in Alaska proved it could hold not only planes, but entire bases. Japanese intelligence analysts debated endlessly about the northern threat. Some insisted it was a psychological operation, that the Americans wanted Japan to waste resources defending Hokkaido. Others argued the reports were real, but without proof, the imperial staff remained divided. In May 1945, one frustrated officer wrote in his memo, "If they truly fly from ice, we have already lost the war of imagination." He wasn't wrong. Back in Alaska, as summer approached, the men of Operation Icefield faced their own crisis. Melting. Runways had to be rebuilt daily. Engineers worked through the night pouring layer after layer of refrozen water, hauling crushed gravel from distant quarries to reinforce the base. The effort bordered on madness, but command refused to abandon the project. By June, Temperatures had stabilized just enough to continue operations. A new schedule was set. Fly at night, when the ice hardened. Every sortie was a race against the sunrise. The cold, once their enemy, had become their ally again. By mid-1945, Japan's military still considered Alaska a frozen wasteland. But to American strategists, it was a corridor, a direct line from Fairbanks to Hokkaido, from frozen tundra to flaming city. In the months ahead, the ice-field squadrons would make that corridor real. And when they did, the Empire would finally learn that in modern war, even the cold could burn. The night of July 10, 1945, was unlike any other Japan had endured. The northern sky, normally quiet, unthreatening, almost forgotten, came alive with distant thunder. Fishermen on the coast of Hokkaido saw the horizon flash white, then red, and for the first time they heard it. The unmistakable, earth-shaking drone of B-29s arriving not from the south, but from the pole. No alarms were sounded. Radar operators were asleep, confident that the enemy's routes lay thousands of miles away near the Marianas. The first bombs fell before Tokyo's high command even knew the north was under attack. The target was Otaru, a port city that stored petroleum and aviation fuel for the Imperial Navy. For months, it had been considered beyond Allied reach. Now the harbor erupted in sheets of flame as the first wave of superfortresses, launched from frozen Alaska, descended through icy fog. From above, the spectacle was surreal. B-29 crews looked down on the fires reflecting off the snow-tipped mountains, a mirror of orange and black. Their bombs detonated in slow rhythm, thunder muffled by clouds, the echoes rolling across the Sea of Japan. Within 15 minutes, the fuel depots were gone. The convoy that had been scheduled to depart for the Kurils that morning would never sail. At Ladd Field, 3,000 miles away, officers listened to the returning transmissions through static. One pilot's voice came faint but proud. Target destroyed. Returning by Aurora Light. The message was passed through encrypted channels to Washington. The Northern Corridor had worked. Again. General Hap Arnold's reply was simple. Tell them the impossible has now become routine. Japan's response was confusion, bordering on denial. By the following afternoon, radio broadcasts from Tokyo described the attack as an act of fate. Military censors refused to acknowledge American aircraft were involved. Privately, naval staff argued it must have been an ammunition accident. How could bombers take off from ice when even their own fighters struggled on paved runways? Only when wreckage from American incendiaries was recovered near Hakodate did the truth become undeniable. Each casing bore the manufacturer's mark. Made in Detroit, Michigan. The irony was bitter. Detroit's factories, once powered by women mechanics and soy rubber tires, now reached Japan by way of the Arctic Circle. Over the next weeks, the raids continued. Small groups of B-29s launched from Alaska in darkness, following magnetic headings across the Bering Sea. They flew under the aurora, invisible to radar, their silver fuselages reflecting ghostly green light. Targets included rail yards, shipbuilding docks, and communication hubs in northern Honshu. The Japanese called them Yuki Bakudan, the snow bombers. The name carried both awe and disbelief. Pilots described the missions as the loneliest of the war. They flew for hours over nothing but white, a flat infinity of ice and water. At times, the horizon vanished completely, leaving only instruments and instinct. Frost crept across their windshields, oxygen froze inside masks, and the aurora danced like silent lightning around the cockpit glass. Navigator Lieutenant Jack Warren later wrote, "It felt like flying through heaven toward hell. The sky was beautiful, but we knew where we were headed." Fuel calculations were merciless. A single deviation could mean ditching in the Arctic. where no rescue was possible. And yet, every crew made it back. Not a single B-29 was lost to enemy fire on those northern routes. Japanese radar technicians grew frantic. They increased patrols over the Kurils, sent reconnaissance flights toward the Aleutians, and even begged the Navy to relocate destroyers north. But fuel shortages made it impossible. The empire that once stretched from the Indian Ocean to Alaska's doorstep now struggled to keep a dozen ships fueled. Admiral Toyota summarized the crisis bluntly in his July 22nd report. "They attack from where no man should fly. We cannot defend the sky itself." As the raids escalated, a second threat emerged: the psychological effect. Civilians in northern Japan began to believe the Americans could appear anywhere, at any time, from any direction. Rumors spread that the bombers used the aurora as camouflage, or that the ice itself hid invisible airfields. When children in Sapporo saw green lights flicker in the night sky, they cried, "The snow bombers are coming." The imperial government tried to suppress the panic, but even officers began to whisper that the North had betrayed them. Meanwhile, engineers at the ice bases worked around the clock. The constant takeoffs and landings carved grooves into the frozen runways. Each night they flooded the cracks with water, letting the cold weld them shut by morning. Every sortie was a gamble. Every return was a miracle. The air crews joked that the ice wanted them to succeed. It froze just long enough for each mission to lift off, then cracked after the last wheel left the ground. In early August, the raids grew bolder. Entire formations of B-29s, up to 30 at a time, took off from Alaskan bases to strike the industrial corridor of northern Honshu. Coal plants, refineries, and communication centers were flattened. Japan's northern logistics network, already strained, collapsed entirely. From his office in Berlin before Germany's surrender, Albert Speer had once remarked, "America builds airfields faster than we can bomb them." Now, months later, the Japanese High Command realized that America could even build them out of ice. The Arctic night had a strange way of concealing fury. From a distance, the horizon glowed faintly, as if dawn were approaching. But it wasn't dawn. It was warlight, the kind that flickered on the snow like a heartbeat, dull, red, and endless. By late August 1945, the B-29s from Alaska were flying at full strength. Dozens at a time now roared from the frozen runways of Ladd Field, Galena, and Shemya, wings glittering beneath the aurora, bomb bays heavy with fire. Each mission carved another scar into Japan's northern infrastructure, erasing one more piece of its war machine. What had begun as an engineering experiment, a theory that ice could bear the weight of total war, had become the final hammer stroke of the Pacific Campaign. Tsunade, first large-scale raid, struck Muroran, Japan's steel capital on Hokkaido's southern coast. The city was ringed by blast furnaces and shipyards, vital to the production of war materials. At 2:14 a.m., the sky turned white. Tracer rounds streaked upward like sparks from a forge. Then came the roar, a noise that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Eyewitnesses in nearby villages described the sea burning like oil. Within an hour, Muroran's industrial district ceased to exist. Every furnace was cracked open. Every crane twisted and collapsed. From Alaska, American intelligence received confirmation through intercepted Japanese radio traffic. Entire factory complex destroyed. Estimate loss, total. The ice fields had delivered their message. Tokyo could no longer ignore the northern threat. Meetings at the Imperial General Headquarters grew frantic. Reports from Hokkaido contradicted one another, some claiming small bomber formations, others hundreds of aircraft. The confusion was total. Interceptors were scrambled from bases around Honshu, but they never found the enemy. The bombers came and went like ghosts, vanishing into the polar mist. Admiral Toyota ordered destroyers north to guard the Hokkaido coast. But by then, fuel reserves were nearly gone. One destroyer ran aground after her compass froze in its housing. Another turned back halfway through the Sea of Okhotsk when her engines seized from cold. The Empire's war machine was literally freezing to death. For the men stationed at the Alaskan bases, the success came at a cost. Frostbite was rampant. Oxygen systems failed mid-flight. On one mission, the co-pilot of Arctic Queen froze to death at his station after the cabin heater failed, his hand still gripping the throttle. Yet, his crew completed the mission, dropped their payload, and brought the bomber home. When asked later why they didn't turn back, the pilot simply said, "Because the runway was waiting for us." It was more than courage. It was ritual. Every man who flew from the ice felt bound to it. The endless white, the silence, the way it glowed under the engines like molten glass. They believed the land itself wanted revenge. American engineers, meanwhile, were facing their own crisis. Repeated takeoffs were tearing the frozen runways apart. Stress fractures spidered through the ice like lightning. Entire sections had to be rebuilt daily using steam jets and flood pumps. Fuel trucks idled in sub-zero darkness while crews sprayed fresh layers of water, letting the Arctic night harden it before the next sortie. They called it overnight runway surgery. One officer joked, "Our airfields melt every morning, but so does Japan's will to fight." Japan's remaining intelligence officers grew desperate. They questioned captured American pilots, studied debris from bombings, and even consulted Arctic explorers for advice on how the enemy could be operating in such conditions. All evidence pointed to the impossible. The Americans had truly mastered the ice. A report from the Imperial Army Air Bureau, dated August 18th, summarized the nightmare. "We have confirmed that the enemy launches large bombers from the polar region. Their bases are undetectable and their aircraft immune to interception. We cannot adapt. Our infrastructure and resources cannot support Arctic counteraction." That report was delivered to Tokyo the same morning Emperor Hirohito recorded his surrender message. But the ice bombers didn't stop. The raids continued for days after the official ceasefire as communication lagged across the Pacific. The final northern strike, a formation of 12 B-29s, left Ladd Field on August 20th, bound for Hokkaido's remaining oil reserves. They were recalled mid-flight after confirmation of Japan's surrender, turning back over the North Pacific. As they crossed the frozen coastline, the aurora burst into brilliant green and gold ribbons, nature's salute to the last mission launched from the Arctic. The pilots didn't speak. They simply throttled down and let the light wash over the wings. After the war, the story of the ice runways nearly vanished. Most records were sealed, classified under experimental Arctic operations. Official histories credited the Marianas and Tinian as the primary bases for Japan's destruction. The frozen frontier remained a footnote, its engineers forgotten, its pilots unsung. But those who had been there remembered. The silence, the wind, the moment when the engines first shattered the stillness and rose into the dawn. They had flown from ice and brought fire to an empire. And even when history turned its gaze elsewhere, the Arctic kept their secret, buried beneath layers of snow and memory. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the sound of engines over the Arctic faded into memory. The bombers that had once scorched the night skies above Hokkaido now sat silent on frozen airstrips, engines blanketed in frost, propellers motionless. For the men who had lived among the snow and darkness, the sudden quiet was almost unbearable. After months of roaring, one mechanic wrote in his journal, the silence felt louder than war. The war in the Pacific was over, but the Arctic front was already being buried by ice and secrecy. Within weeks, U.S. command began dismantling Operation Icefield. Orders came from Washington to decommission the temporary runways, destroy documentation, and classify the entire project. The world would know about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but not about Alaska. To reveal that America could build bomber airfields out of ice, capable of launching nuclear-capable B-29s across the pole, was to reveal too much. The Cold War was already beginning, and the lessons learned from the frozen fields would soon belong to another race. One not fought with bombs, but with silence. At Ladd Field, bulldozers carved trenches through the once glittering runways. Explosives shattered the frozen surface so that it would melt faster come spring. Within weeks, the ice that had carried the weight of world history was nothing but water. Engineers and pilots were reassigned without ceremony. The men who had defied physics and geography were told to forget what they'd seen. Some went home to farms and factories, some to test programs in Nevada and New Mexico. None of them spoke publicly about what they had built. In debriefings, they referred to it only as the line. When asked what it meant, one engineer simply said, "It was where the world ended and began again." In Japan, the story was different. For years after the surrender, rumors persisted among surviving imperial officers. They remembered the fires on Hokkaido, the bombers that had come from nowhere, the radar blips that appeared out of the polar clouds. But post-war historians dismissed those accounts as memory errors. Official records made no mention of attacks from the north. The surviving reports had been burned in Tokyo's final days, and the few that remained were sealed by American occupation authorities. By the 1950s, the very idea of a northern air offensive had faded into myth, a ghost story told among retired officers. Then, in 1967, a Japanese research team conducting geological surveys on the Kuril Islands uncovered something extraordinary. Buried beneath layers of permafrost, they found fragments of an aircraft, aluminum rivets, hydraulic fittings, and a partial serial plate stamped with B-29-51BW. The coordinates placed it hundreds of miles north of the known bombing routes. At first, historians thought it must have been a weather plane or an Arctic ferry accident, but the condition of the wreckage told another story. Bomb racks, flare casings, and .50 caliber shell links frozen in the soil. Whoever had flown this bomber hadn't been lost. They'd been on a mission. In Tokyo, the discovery reignited an old question. Had the Americans truly launched bombers from the ice? Journalists combed through surviving wartime diaries. One entry, written by a radar operator on Hokkaido in 1945, stood out. Strange lights above the clouds, traveling east to west. No sound, only vibration. Command says it's lightning. But lightning doesn't fly in formation. The note was dismissed for decades as imagination. Now, it looked prophetic. Meanwhile, in the United States, veterans of Operation Icefield were beginning to grow old. One by one, they started speaking. In letters, interviews, and at reunions nobody reported. They described the nights when the aurora shone brighter than the runway lights, when frost covered the bomber's wings like armor. They spoke of fear, exhaustion, and pride, and of a truth they had carried in silence for decades. Captain Leonard Briggs, one of the few surviving pilots, told a historian in 1971, "They laughed when we said we'd build runways out of ice. But ice was just another kind of ground. You respect it, you understand it, and it'll carry you." It carried us all the way to Japan. By the late 1980s, satellite imagery began to reveal strange rectangular formations near abandoned Wawadwach sites in western Alaska. Historians comparing the coordinates found they matched the descriptions of Icefield's secret bases. Faint outlines of graded runways were still visible under the snow, scarred, melted, but unmistakably man-made. The Pentagon never confirmed their origin. Requests under the Freedom of Information Act were denied. files cited as destroyed or transferred. But every new image told the same story. The ice still remembered. In 1992, the Smithsonian Institution quietly received a donation from an anonymous pilot's family. A brass plate, tarnished and bent, etched with a simple inscription. Lad Field, 1945, the sky was frozen, but we flew. No further explanation accompanied it. It was placed in storage, unlisted, among artifacts of the Alaskan campaigns. Only decades later would researchers piece it together, that the frozen sky was no metaphor. It was literal. By the 21st century, declassified weather and operations reports began surfacing online. Each fragment added to the mosaic, flight logs, marked Arctic corridor, radio messages labeled cold front, route, and engineering notes describing temporary frozen taxiways capable of supporting 140,000 lbs gross weight. It was all real. The Ice-Runway bombers had existed. They had flown, fought, and disappeared, leaving only steam, silence, and myth behind. As one modern historian wrote, "In the age of total war, the United States conquered not nations, but the elements themselves. They turned water into steel, cold into motion, and the Arctic into a weapon." The world remembered Hiroshima's fire, but few remembered the ice that came before it, the frozen genesis of a strategy that made fire possible. And beneath that Arctic silence, the ghosts of the bombers still slept. Wings folded under permafrost, engines encased in eternal cold, waiting for the world to remember what the snow once hid.
The rediscovery didn't begin with generals or historians. It began with a storm. In the winter of 2003, a violent thaw swept across Alaska's interior. Winds tore through Fairbanks, rain fell on frozen rivers, and a glacier north of Lad Field, now Fort Wainwright, cracked open for the first time in half a century. When the snow melt subsided, something strange appeared in the ice. A curve of metal, riveted and dull gray, half buried in blue. The object was unmistakably man-made. Within weeks, archaeologists from the University of Alaska confirmed it. The remains of an aircraft hangar, constructed entirely from frozen composite layers of ice and plywood. Its walls still holding shape after 60 years. The structure shouldn't have existed. No record, no blueprint, no military acknowledgement mentioned such a design, but the ice had remembered. As excavation began, more fragments emerged. Frozen beneath layers of compacted snow were fuel drums, rusted oxygen bottles, and the bent frame of a bulldozer engine with U.S. Army serial markings. Beside them lay something that changed everything. A wooden crate, sealed and preserved in the cold, stenciled in faded black letters, Project Icefield in Alaska, 1944. Inside were reels of 16mm film, rolls of microfiche, and a dozen waterproof notebooks written in pencil. Every page told the same impossible story: coordinates, wind speed charts, structural diagrams for frozen composite surfaces, and handwritten mission logs listing aircraft by number and pilot. The entries ran through August 1945. The final page read only, "Cease operations. Ice holds, end of line." When the discovery reached Washington, archivists were ordered to review the material. The files were labeled under the long-dead Army Air Force's Polar Operations Division, one of dozens of wartime offices disbanded in 1946. What they found stunned them. Operational maps of the Aleutian and Siberian corridors, radio frequencies used for Arctic navigation, and mission reports confirming over 20 sorties from frozen airfields targeting northern Japan. It was the smoking gun historians had searched for. Operation Icefield had existed, and it had worked. News of the find spread slowly, then virally. Documentaries began airing under titles like The Frozen Front and The Bombers Who Came from Ice. Veterans groups held reunions for the first time since 1945, their members now frail and few. Some were seeing proof of their own stories for the first time. One former crew chief, then 92 years old, was shown footage recovered from the reels. Film of men flooding the runway with hoses, the water steaming as it froze in the wind. B-29s rolling into position under the aurora. He wept quietly and said, "We thought no one would ever believe us. The snow kept our secret better than we could." Japan, too, took notice. Historians from Hokkaido University petitioned the U.S. for access to the recovered archives, seeking to confirm the unexplained northern air raids of 1945. Among the newly declassified logs were mission summaries matching dates of long-dismissed, unknown explosions in Otaru and Muroran. The discovery rewrote a piece of history long thought settled. The Pacific War had not been fought solely from the tropics, but from the top of the world. By 2010, international researchers had begun reconstructing the icefield bases digitally. Using satellite radar and LIDAR scans, they mapped faint runway outlines still embedded in permafrost. Each base was precisely where the old notebook said it would be: Ladfield, Galena, Shemya, Nome. Even after decades of thaw and snow, the Earth still bore the scars, straight lines where nature never makes them. In some spots, the ice itself seemed to resist melting, as if the chemical mix of antifreeze and sawdust had fossilized. Scientists called it cryogenic concrete. What wartime engineers invented out of desperation had become a marvel of frozen preservation. When the findings were made public, the world reacted with fascination. The media called it America's lost Arctic miracle. Historians called it the Cold War before the Cold War. And in Alaska, locals began referring to the old Ladfield ruins as the Ice Cathedral, a monument to the men who built airfields out of nothing but wind, water, and will. In Fairbanks, a museum opened a permanent exhibit in 2012, Operation Icefield, The Runways of Silence. Inside were pieces of the recovered hangar wall, fragments of frostbitten propeller blades, and one of the notebooks found in the crate. On display under glass was the same line written by a nameless engineer in 1945. The ice holds. Even now, military historians debate how much the Arctic route truly influenced Japan's collapse. Some argue that the Alaskan sorties were symbolic, testing endurance more than delivering decisive blows. Others insist they disrupted Japan's final fuel supply lines and shattered its psychological sense of safety. But nearly all agree on one truth: the feat itself was unprecedented. To build functional runways out of frozen lakes and permafrost, to launch the world's heaviest bombers from them in wartime conditions, that was something no other nation had even imagined. As one historian put it, America had not only won the war of production, it had won the war against nature. Today, pilots flying transpolar routes from Anchorage to Tokyo still pass over the silent ridges where those runways once gleamed. Below them lies the same frozen wilderness, featureless, white, eternal. Every so often, sunlight catches the outline of something geometric beneath the ice, the ghost of a runway that once carried fire. And though the engines that thundered across it are long gone, the wind still hums faintly through the tundra, carrying the same low vibration those bombers made as they rose toward Japan. It's a sound only the Arctic remembers, the echo of wings forged from ice and of a war that reached the edge of the world.